stream the meeting. Last time I did a test yesterday and it worked. Well, sort of. It did work. It takes about 30 seconds, I think. Hang on a second. Done. Redirecting to YouTube.
Yeah, it says YouTube.
Ah,
Okay.
there we go. Excellent. Okay, but now where we are, let me just get back to Zoom. Done. Okay. Hold on. Hey guys, I believe we are now streaming live to YouTube. And we can post the link and post the video to our various sites, the Facebook page, to Twitter X, to our rodserling.com site. So let's start with the reason we're here. We're here to mark no pun intended, the 50th anniversary of Rod's passing on June 28th, 1975. I think it is pretty remarkable that it is 50 years. I was not quite 5 years old when Rod died. You guys were a little bit older. So, Mark Dawidziak, I'm sure I've asked you this previously, and you've probably talked about it. But do you remember? Well, first, where you were when you heard the news that Rod died, and how old you were, and what was your first exposure to Rod Serling? I assume it was the Twilight Zone, but do you remember that initial reaction, the initial exposure to Rod's work?
I not only remember it, I remember what I was doing 50 years ago today, almost to the moment. And I remember what I was doing 10 years ago to the day, because 10 years ago to this day, I was writing the Everything I Need to Know I Learned from the Twilight Zone book. And I was starting the chapter on Rod Serling. And it didn't even occur to me. I mean, this is what I wrote. I just called this up just so, I'll share this with you. But this was what I wrote that day, 10 years ago. Everybody has those Twilight Zone moments now and then. The show has become so ingrained in our consciousness, such a universally recognized pop culture reference, that we actually call them Twilight Zone moments. In fact, I'm having one right now. Really, imagine, if you will, that you are reading these words in real time, just as they are being written, just as they are appearing on a computer screen, over which hangs a painting of Rod Serling. All right, then guess what day it is? Chance, fate, or the Twilight Zone. Stage managed matters so that I'm writing this chapter about Rod Serling on the 40th anniversary of his death. I certainly didn't plan it that way. I wouldn't have planned it that way. But this was the way that the waiting step on the Twilight Zone trail arranged it. And when precious time finally was available for the next item on the writing docket, the calendar confirmed the coincidence. It is indeed June 28th, 2015. I remember where I was 40 years ago. I was driving across upstate New York, starting a cross-country trip. I was 18, and I had packed both of Rod Serling's paperback collections of Night Gallery stories for reading at stops along the way. It was an extremely hot and bright summer day. The sun was blaring in a manner reminiscent of Serling's 1961 Twilight Zone episode, The Midnight Sun. Air conditioning in that gold Oldsmobile Cutlass meant rolling down the windows and letting highway speed push the sultry air around in the baked interior. The sad news was delivered by the car radio. Somewhere, not too far away in Rochester, New York, Rod Serling had died. He was 50 years old and his great heart had given out. How do you respond when a hero dies? I'm not sure what thoughts ran through my head at the time, but I can tell you, without equivocation, that it is possible to be positively roasted by summer heat and still feel cold. So I know exactly what I was doing 10 years ago, and I know what I was doing 50 years ago. I was actually driving right across upstate New York. And the other part of your question was, my first exposure to the Twilight Zone was probably at about the age of 10 to Rod Serling. It was a Twilight Zone episode. I'm never quite sure which one it was. I just know that it was on WPIX Channel 11 in New York. It had gone into reruns. I'm not old enough to have watched the Twilight Zone in its first run, but it went immediately into syndication. And I discovered it at the age of 10 in around 1966. So, and no looking back at that point.
And Mark, of course, you knew Rod. The two of us did not. Um, I guess just your general thoughts on a day like today.
Yeah, I knew Rod for what turned out to be the last 10 years of his life, from the time I was 14 till the time I was 24 when he died. So this particular year, it's not too hard to figure out how old I am, that I've got a couple of years on you guys. Um, but as you may remember, sometime I think that spring, Rod had a heart attack, and he seemed to be getting better. I had sent him a note, get well note. I'd gotten one back from him, and I assumed that he was, on the mend. Then I think probably 50 years ago yesterday, I got a call from a friend of mine named Jim Rowley, who was a night reporter for the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. And he said, we've just gotten word from Strong Memorial Hospital. Rod Serling went into surgery and it didn't go well, and he's not expected to survive. And that was how I found out. And the next day, um, I got several calls, particularly one from a reporter I knew at the Washington Post, asking me to help him put together an obituary. And I was bereft. I mean, this was my great hero, and he had been very, very kind to me. Um, and so the only thing I could think to do is I was writing for, I was actually working for the Washington Bureau of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch at that point. And I was also freelancing for New Times Magazine, which was kind of a hip with it magazine of the time in the 1970s. And in each issue, it came out bi-weekly, as I recall, and in each issue, the last page was called Final Tribute. And it was a full page article about something or somebody that was now gone. Either it could be an obituary, it could be something that was ending, whatever. So I called the managing editor, Frank Rich, who I knew very well, who later became the drama critic for the New York Times. And I said, Frank, I want to write it. I want the final tribute this issue about Rod Serling. And I told him about my relationship, and he said, okay. We went through it. I wrote the article. And then Frank said, I think I have the headline. And I said, okay, what do you want to call it? And he said, Requiem for a Heavyweight. And immediately I knew that was the right thing to call it. So, I know, Nick, that on the Facebook Zoom that you did earlier, you talked about Rod's significance and the Twilight Zone significance. And this is something that Mark and I have talked about a lot, and I know he can contribute more than what I'm going to say. I say that I am of the generation, the 1960s generation, that was idealistic enough to think that anything was possible, and at the same time cynical enough to think that nothing was true. And I think a lot of that came from the Twilight Zone. We learned to believe in fantasy, to believe in the possibilities, to expand the imagination, and at the same time to question everything. And Mark and I talked a lot about this as he was writing his book. So, Mark, I think you can probably pick up on what I'm saying, and I know you believe it.
Yeah, oh yeah, and I always, for as enduring as Rod's celebrity has been, that he continues to be recognized and his work continues to be recognized. I think it is possible to sort of underestimate his contribution.
Absolutely.
And I think that one of the reasons for that is that ironically, Rod is best known for a show which was about irony. He was known for the Twilight Zone, and that has somewhat defined him completely, and with good reason. It's a magnificent contribution uh, in so many ways, on so many levels. But at the same time, it was only part of the who he was as a writer. He was such a much bigger writer than just the Twilight Zone. Uh, but a genre show has defined him, and we tend to always take genre writers and relegate them to the children's table of literature. We tend to sort of push them aside a little bit.
Ghetto.
And I think that is, one of the great, the one way we underestimate Rod is that even though he famously said, that in his last interview that it wouldn't matter if people didn't know one thing that he wrote just so that they could recognize his name and say he was a writer. That's going to be true 100 years from now. It's true 50 years after his death. But I hope that in the next 50 years, the growing recognition will be that this was not just a great fantasy writer, not just a great television writer, not just a great science fiction writer, whatever you want to put in front of that name. This was a great American writer.
I'd like to pick up on that and bring you both into this. As many people in the Serling orbit know, I was probably the only one who Rod actually authorized to write a book about him. I was very young at the time, in my early 20s, and I approached Rod and said, I'd like to write your biography in the context of the history of television, which was relatively short at that point. And he said, well, that's quite an honor that you're giving me to want to write a book about me. And of course, I will cooperate in any way you like. I will, I think he said something like probe the diminishing recesses of my brain for memories and all that. He said, but I have to warn you, I don't think anybody's going to be interested. I don't think anybody's going to want a book about me. And unfortunately, after I wrote the proposal and showed it to him and all that, we sent my agent at the time sent it out to various publishers, and there really was no interest. So I think Rod would be staggered now to know how many books there are. I mean, Anne Serling's memoir, which I helped her with, Nick's monumental book, which is, definitive in its way. Mark's book, Everything I Knew, Everything I Know, whatever I've learned from the Twilight Zone, which he was kind enough to incorporate me in. But I think he would be staggered to know this. He would, and I think of all the things, all the tributes, I think the one that would move him the most, and Nick, I know you and I have talked about this, is the fact that the fifth grade classes in Binghamton, New York, are using the Twilight Zone to talk about current issues, to talk about ethics, to talk about values, to talk about society. So, Nick, why don't you just take off on that?
Yeah, that's something I should have mentioned on our Facebook page post, and I forgot kind of, is that this just recently, that Fifth Dimension program in Binghamton, that I was able to address 7 different elementary schools in front of the statue of Rod in Binghamton and talk about they had just watched 5 episodes of The Twilight Zone. I believe they watched 1 per week in their 5th grade class, and they all loved it. I mean, I asked every class what their favorite episode was, and I got different answers from every kid in every class. I got surprising answers, I got good questions, and they really enjoyed it. And that is yeah, Brad would, I think he would take that as one of his greatest tributes, that the younger generation is still, learning from his work and carrying it on. I know in one of the recent newsletters I wrote about, I went through the Ithaca College archives, and I was going through the stuff there, and I found a box of letters that Rod received from I believe it was a fifth grade class, maybe even younger, maybe a 4th grade class of kids in Texas. I believe it was in Houston, Texas. And they were all, and this was in 1973, I believe, 72, 73. And And he kept it. And it was all people. They wrote drawings to him. They wrote tribute letters to him, telling him how much they liked. Most of it was about Night Gallery because that was the current show at the time, and most of it about how much they loved Night Gallery. And I think it says something that he kept it. He kept this box of letters. So just that speaks to how he would think that the younger generation viewing his stuff would just be. I think he would be incredibly humbled by it.
At
You know,
last year's Serling Fest, which commemorated Rod's 100th anniversary, um, Mark and I and Ann Serling, his younger daughter, did a program on Rod's values. And that's something that I think we cannot underestimate in any way. Um, I think I got a lot of my values from Rod. The fact that he thought that prejudice was the one of the greatest evils on earth, the fact that he treated people so well, all of that, that is why I think he endures, because his values come across so clearly in his writing.
I
And
don't think there's any doubt about that. That's why we're still talking about him, and that he was able to deliver those messages in a way that entertains, and that more often than not was not delivered by sledgehammer. That was somewhat subtle and was secondary to the story that he was telling. It was it was inherent in the story he was telling. It was not taking away from the story he was telling. He found a way to get those messages across in these brilliant ways.
And I'll give you an example that is kind of a sledgehammer in a way. Um, I knew somebody older than me, obviously, named Monroe Mike Newman, who had gone to Antioch with Rod. And one of the times that Ann Serling came down to visit me in Washington, I said, "Well, we're going to have lunch with Mike Newman, and he's going to tell you his memories of your father." And he told a story about that there were two barbershops in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and one refused to cut black people's hair, and the other would cut anybody's hair. And Rod, as a student, as an undergraduate at Antioch, created this whole campaign and personally enforced it, Mike said, that Antioch students only go to the barbershop that would cut everybody's hair and boycott the barbershop that would not cut black people's hair. And I know each of you have many stories like this that you know of Rod's values and where he put himself on the line.
At a time when that was not easy to
That's
do.
right. That's right.
Not that it's ever easy to do, but in the 1940s, and we're talking
Right.
or yeah, 19
Would have been about 19,
late 40s,
this would have been about
47, 48.
1947, probably.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, that is not, I mean, I talk about in my book a script that he wrote for The Storm, the show he was writing for in Cincinnati in 1951, called As Yet Untitled, which is about an incident of prejudice against a Chinese American couple. And this is a man or a Japanese American couple, an Asian American couple. I forget exactly what the country, which country it was, but this is a man who had just fought the Japanese in World War II, and he comes back and he writes this story that is showing how ridiculous it was to be prejudiced against this couple for the color of their skin, and the local TV listings actually said in the description, an Asian American couple is targeted because of the color of their skin. I mean, that was in the description, and this is next to like Little Orphan Annie and things like this. So I mean, Rod was writing stuff that was that was showing his values from the get go, from 1951. He was that was in part of his DNA. He was always going to be writing from that perspective.
And Mark, if I'm not mistaken, Rod was really the first person to consciously feature black actors on The Twilight Zone, Ivan Dixon and people like that. Am I not correct?
Oh yeah, it's especially in the dramatic context.
Yeah, right.
Might show up here and there in peripheral characters in comedy, but he really put them front and center. And but picking up on what Nick, what you were just saying is the other part of the DNA, and the part that is really makes Rod dynamite. Because to get dynamite, you have to get the right blend of things. If you don't, it's not explosive. And the other part that of Rod that made the dynamite was that you have those incredible values that we're all talking about, and it fueled his passion, fueled his work, fueled who he was. But the other half was he was a first-rate storyteller,
Yes.
and he understood something innately, which is we learn through stories. From our earliest age, we learn through stories. You know, whether you call them parables, whether you call them plays, whether you call them novels, whatever you want to call them, you get an education in a classroom, but you truly learn through storytelling. And this guy was one of the best natural storytellers that's ever been put on the planet. And that's why those stories still resonate with those fifth grade students. Those still are great
It's
stories. You can show those stories at any point
And
to people.
how many times have each of us been approached with the with the line that begins, "Do you remember the one about dot dot dot?"
yeah. I'm
Incredible.
glad. Yeah, I'm glad you put it that way, Mark. And you know, it's the storytelling, yes, and the fact that he did it on television. You
Yeah.
know, where a medium that could reach millions and millions of people. And it should be noted again. I mean, Rod, there's much has been said and written about Rod's role in television history. And Rod recognized from the get go that, you know, this was an incredibly powerful medium that it reaches so many people. And he felt a responsibility that if I'm going to reach this many people, I better have something to say. And so that's, you know, another reason that these stories were infused with something more than just entertainment, because he felt a responsibility to do that, to educate and to inform.
Yeah. I mean, he recognized it early too. I mean, he recognized
Yeah.
right at the there's an amazing essay. He's not writing about Rod, but the great drama critic Walter Kerr wrote a piece in the 1950s. And he talks about and Kerr was primarily known as a theater guy,
Right.
a theater critic. And he had seen something on television, a live drama the night before. And it galvanized him. It absolutely galvanized him because what he said was he realized for as much junk that was on television back then, because they always called it the golden age, and there was a lot of roller derby and wrestling and game shows and stuff, stupid stuff on TV back then. It wasn't quite the golden age that we always remember the good, best stuff. But he was saying, you know, he realized this was something new. This it wasn't quite theater. It was sort of theater, but it wasn't quite theater. It wasn't movies, but it was kind of movies. It wasn't radio, but it was kind of radio. This was something new, and if you missed it, you couldn't make up your experience anywhere else in the landscape, on the pop culture landscape. This was the only way to get it was
And
through this
because
new
of the
medium.
because of the technical limitations of the time, it was like theater. It was live.
It was a little bit of all of those things, and yet it was something new. And Kerr is recognized this as a critic in the mid 1950s. Rod recognized it right from the start. I think he seizes on this right from the beginning and sees the storm. You know, he sees it in Cincinnati, what the possibilities are. You know, he's primarily kind of an instinct to playwright, but he's taking those instincts into a different medium where you never say Rod Serling playwright, but that's essentially what he was doing. And so, yeah, the legacy is incredible. Again, this isn't all the ways I think, you know, he gets underestimated because the one accomplishment is so big. And he's not just, you know, he's the principal writer on the Twilight Zone. He writes the 92 of the 156 scripts. He's the host, he's the narrator, he's the executive producer, he's the showrunner. I mean, this is a big accomplishment. If this was the only thing he'd ever done, we'd probably still be talking about him. But
And I can tell you, Nick referred to the last couple of years of his life when he wasn't as productive, and I can tell you, he didn't. Personally, I can tell you, he did not realize, or he wouldn't admit his significance. I mean, he didn't understand it. I mean, he would be. He sometimes referred to himself as barely adequate, which of course is ridiculous, but
Yeah.
um, he made a few mistakes in his life. One was learning to smoke, obviously, which we all were upset about. Number two was selling off his rights to the Twilight Zone to CBS when they convinced him that they weren't worth anything. And number three was he was not a good judge of his own of his own significance. I mean, I think he understood what he could do. And I remember once asking him, I said, Rod, does the writing get any easier as you get older? And he said, no, but you become less afraid of it. And so that certainly turned out to be true too. But
And I have to say, as a fan, that honestly, that quality, Rod Stern, that humility, is one of the things that endears him to people like me.
absolutely,
Because
100%,
if
man.
he were beating his chest and saying how great he was all the time, I don't think I would admire him as
No,
much as I do. But
he was
when I hear
humble,
these, yes, and when
he
I
was
hear him talk
generous.
about momentarily adequate, and they'll never remember me 100 years from now, you want to reach into the past and smack him, say, Rod, this is better than you realize it is. This is going to last. You're great. You want to give him a hug.
And the
That's
other
how.
thing I will say, just on a personal level, which obviously did not come off in his hosting of the Twilight Zone, he was incredibly funny. He had an amazing sense of humor, and he was always trying to make people around him laugh. And he was great at it. And he was a great joke teller. I can tell you from personal experience.
Well, that goes along with being a great storyteller. I
Yeah,
get
I think
it.
it does.
Yeah. Well,
You know,
guys,
and I would shift this a little bit just to change the tone of this, because obviously, we're here because this marks the 50th anniversary of Rod's passing. It's a significant day in a lot of ways, but not the least of which is once we get past this day, we are now in the territory where he will have been gone longer than he was here.
Yes.
I mean, and that is significant. But I think we always have got to emphasize that this is merely the anniversary of his physical death.
Yes.
Is that, you both know that I often compare Rod to Mark Twain, another great American writer, because they both were moralists in disguise. They were both using their forms to couch the moral and get it across. And they were both deeply moral writers. Um, But I think one other thing that was very significant about it, you all know the story that 13 years before Twain's death, a reporter was dispatched to he was living in London at the time, and a report had gone around that he was either dying or already dead. And it was a cousin named Clemens who was, and in a story that Rod probably loved, the reporter shows up at the door and Mark Twain answers the door, and famously, his famous answer is, that the reports of my death were greatly exaggerated. The reports of Rod Serling's death are greatly exaggerated.
Well, I'm really glad to hear you say that because I remember for many, many years after he died, I kept his address and phone number in my address book. I mean, we didn't have email in those days, obviously, but I said he's still with us in a way. And even after Carol moved out of the house in Pacific Palisades, I still kept it there because I wanted something to remember him. But another funny thing is I remember apropos of what you were just saying, I asked him once, I said, Rod, all these things that you write about in the Twilight Zone, do you wish they would happen in real life? And he said, yes, but not to me.
Well, and again, I think, from here we go from, sort of this to the ongoing celebration that he was this incredible gift, the Christmas gift that came unwrapped, and he was the gift that kept giving to us as long as he was here. And that is truly something to celebrate.
Yeah, and I think it reminds me of the line that was said over Lincoln's dead body and across the street from Ford's Theater. Now he belongs to the ages.
Mm-hmm. And indeed he does.
To quote a game of pool, George Clayton Johnson, you're not dead as long as people talk about you. You're not really dead. or to quote Star Trek 2, he's not really dead as long as we remember him. So yes, Rod Serling lives on for sure. And
As
guys,
William Faulkner said, the past, what did he say, Mark? The past
past isn't even really past.
Yeah, it's
right.
Yeah, it's always with us. It is
Yeah.
all,
Yeah.
you know, and I think that's tremendously true of writers who speak to us, because, you know, another parallel I think with Twain is that Rod Serling's writing still seems relevant and resonant today, and that is,
maybe
and it
more
still
so than
sounds
ever.
like he's talking to us in a language we
Maybe
understand.
more so than ever. And
Yeah,
I'd,
maybe more
Yeah.
so than ever. I think that's true of
Yes.
Joe Twain and
I'd
Serling
like
today.
to deliver a personal note to both of you, which is once Rod died, obviously I had no real interest in writing a book about him again, but I am deeply grateful to both of you for your parts in preserving his legacy. Your books have both been monumental and very important, and I thank you for that.
Well, I'm sure Nick feels the same way, but it's going to always be one of the most incredible honors of my writing life to have that book. You know, no matter how many books I write, no matter what I do or don't do or whatever, that is always going to be a distinct honor to have been able to do that, and be part of that, and to, you know, and to celebrate that. That's a gift. That's another gift.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Listen, he's been my hero since I was about 10 years old. So that's all I can really say. You know, from the first time, well, maybe not, he wasn't my hero from the first time I watched the Twilight Zone, but pretty soon after. It didn't take very long for it to become that way. And so I'm very, very proud to have been able to contribute, you know, to his legacy in some way.
I think the fact that I've been a writer all these years, that I've published 19 books, that I don't know how many television documentaries I produced. I mean, it's because of Rod's influence on me, no question about it.
Well, guys, I will see you in September at Serling Fest, along with a couple of new guests, where we can talk more about Rod's enduring influence, because it does continue and continue. I mentioned a few things on the Facebook post today, and I think this was great. I'm always glad to talk to both of you. All right, guys, we'll end it here.
Great way to commemorate the day.
Yes. All right, guys, you have a great weekend, and we'll see you again soon. All right, bye-bye.
Bye, gents.